Hi YouTube, Darth here. This is Yes or No, a weapon review series where I give a clear and concise answer as to what weapons you should be using in Battlefield 4. Today's weapon is the UMP-45, a weapon that has been a staple in the Battlefield series since Battlefield 2. It's the 45 caliber version of its little brother, the UMP-9, a weapon I gave a no vote to a few months back. But how does the big brother UMP-45 compare? Should you use the UMP-45, yes or no? No. The UMP-45 is a PDW that's a bit closer to breaking even than its little brother, but it has several features that hold it back. It might have more life on consoles or in hardcore, but on PC and normal, it's a definite no. Before I talk about why I voted that way, let's look at what is actually good about the UMP-45. At only 0.38 degrees up, 0.18 left, and 0.18 right, the UMP-45 has one of the most forgiving recoil patterns of the PDWs. It's only beat by its little brother, the UMP-9 and the PP2000. Combine this with a forgiving first shot recoil multiplier of only 1.65 and a rate of fire of only 600 rounds per minute, and you've got yourself a very forgiving weapon. I could see this being a particular attraction to console players and players going for headshots exclusively. At 30 maximum, 15.4 minimum, the UMP-45 puts out the highest damage per bullet of the PDWs. It's enough to drop an enemy in 2 headshots at less than 20 meters on normal or just 1 on hardcore. If you could manage to hit nothing but headshots, this alone might make the gun viable, but as I'll talk about later, this becomes exceptionally difficult even at mid-range. At a blazing fast 1.85 seconds for the round and chamber reload and 2.5 seconds for the long empty reload, the UMP-45 is tied, with many other weapons, for the second fastest reload speed in the game. This comes in handy for extending a long kill streak if the enemy hasn't noticed you. It definitely helps lessen the detraction of the small magazine size. Those are the major positives of the UMP-45. It's a good deal better than its little brother, the UMP-9, and I find that overall it stays fairly competitive if you can manage headshots. Or if you happen to be on hardcore where you need only one shot to the head. In general, I think the UMP-45 is a decent weapon for players who can't control recoil or are maybe new to the game. But the UMP-45's detractions are really where it falls down, so let's look at those now. The UMP-45 has nearly the worst bullet velocity of non-silencer equipped weapons at 340 meters per second. Being a machine pistol, even many of the sidearms fire bullets at a higher velocity than the UMP-45. What this translates to is a horrible performance at range against moving targets. You'll empty out whole magazines into enemies beyond 30 meters and often hit nothing at all. This isn't out of the ordinary for PDWs, as they all have 0.4 to 0.45 degrees of starting spread and have lower velocities. However, it pushes the UMP-45 into an engagement envelope that is slightly shorter than 25 meters. Though it has high initial output, the low rate of fire puts the UMP-45 near the back of the pack when it comes to damage output. At a minimum time to kill of 303 milliseconds, the UMP-45 is in the back half of PDWs and is also behind many assault rifles and carbines. This then pushes that advantageous range of the UMP-45 out of CQB, which is a major problem because of the low velocity I just mentioned. Like most of the rest of the PDWs, the UMP-45 falls off pretty hard at around 30 to 40 meters. If it had great performance in its CQB range, it might be an acceptable trade-off, but much beyond even 25 meters, you're going to be losing to pretty much everything. That sweet 30 damage drops to only 15.4 at range, requiring 7 bullets to kill, which you'll be hard-pressed to land. Those are the big detractions. Like I said earlier, the small magazine is offset by the fast reload, so it's not really a negative. But overall, the UMP-45 struggles to find an identity. Is it supposed to be good in close quarters? Well, it really can't compete with a lot of other options. Like other PDWs, it doesn't do well at long range, and the UMP-45 is particularly crippled by the exceptionally slow bullet velocity. There's a very narrow band in the 10 to 20 meter range where the UMP-45 is at least okay. It's not even the best in that range, which is why on normal, it's a no. It has no hotspot that it fills. Let's take a look at its numbers when compared to other weapons in its neighborhood. I chose the UMP-9, the P90, and the ACE-52 CQB. The UMP-45 has great accuracy, which helps it compete with those weapons, but again, this falls off relatively early around the 15 to 20 meter mark. There fails to be a spot where the UMP-45 is the best, and it really just achieves mediocrity when compared to these weapons. And I think that's the biggest problem the UMP-45 has, and it's a problem that most of the PDWs have. There's too many PDWs, and some like the UMP-45 just don't offer anything up close to make them worth using against their trade-offs. They have to compete with carbines and shotguns for the engineer and against the other PDWs, and many of the PDWs are better than the UMP-45. The only thing the UMP-45 has to offer is headshot power, which is great if you can consistently land headshots, but hard to be consistent with. So let's take a look at how you would go about getting the most accuracy with the UMP-45. The UMP-45 is one of the easier PDWs to control, if not one of the easiest weapons in Battlefield 4. It has a recoil pattern per shot of just 0.38 degrees up, 0.18 left, and 0.18 right. That balanced left-right recoil is a nice advantage when trying to aim consistently. With a forgiving first shot recoil multiplier of 1.65 times, the recoil pattern of the UMP-45 is going to take the weapon straight up and outwards. To counter this recoil, you'll simply need to pull straight down. The spread increase per shot is pretty average at 0.094 degrees per shot, and after some time the spread will get fairly large. The key to controlling the spread is simply to burst the weapon, something you're going to have to do a lot even at moderate distances thanks to the initial spread of 0.4 degrees. As the ideal range of the UMP-45 is around 10 to 20 meters, you're going to want to go for bursts of 2 to 4 rounds for your kill shots. Much more and the spread gets pretty bad, particularly at range. One last thing, if you're going for headshots with this weapon, you may desire to put it in burst firing mode. This will fire 3-round bursts, more than enough to kill any target, and take some of the burden off firing in the right pattern. You'll sacrifice some power, but gain a bit more control. Being a PDW, the UMP-45 has quite a bit of on-the-move power, and its natural hip-fire spread is pretty tight. With the right attachments, you can make that even better, but overall the UMP-45 has a lot of move and shoot power. You'll need this if you get caught heads up with other weapons, as you lack the lasting power of rifles or carbines. Heads up, you'll lose to almost everything. And in general, I found the best strategy for the UMP-45 to be one where you outflank your enemies and come at them from the sides. You'll want a suppressor if you're using this strategy, but in general the UMP-45 is at its strongest when tearing into enemy flanks. This is where having that blazing fast reload can really come in handy. Another tactic that seemed to work pretty well with the UMP-45 was to find a nice spot to duck out of attention and tear into the enemies that way. It's not a very assuming weapon when it's silenced, and it has a lot of surprise power, particularly at very close distances. If you can't get into those close distances, you're going to need to pull out a rocket launcher. For CQB blasters, I find that the SMAW and SRAW tend to be the best complementary rocket launchers for these weapons. You're not going to have a prayer of hitting most everything beyond 30 meters, and for those targets you're going to want a reliable and fast rocket launcher. I tended to run the AT field upgrade when using the UMP-45 to give myself the maximum number of rockets. Since this is a PDW, I expected to see a pretty wide variety of attachments preferred by the top users at BF4stats.com. I wasn't disappointed, as nearly even splits of players used different sights, different barrels, and different grips. But let's talk about what I preferred on my UMP-45. First up, for the sight I preferred the Coyote sight. As the UMP-45 seems to offer the most somewhat up close, this pairs with what also tends to be my favorite CQB sight. It's got the best visibility of the RDS sights for CQB action. However, if you're going for headshots, I could see a preference for the hollows, but for me it was the Coyote. Next, for my accessory I mostly ran with the laser sight. There were a couple of times I ran with the flashlight combo for kicks, but I mostly find the flashlight to be useless in Battlefield 4. The laser, on the other hand, gives you great performance up close, which is where the UMP-45 needs to shine. For the barrel I preferred the suppressor. My preference was not to use the UMP-45 as a headshot machine and instead turn it into a ninja assassin weapon. If you were going for headshots, you'd probably want the heavy barrel. For me, I found that kill streaks would last longer, and in general the performance I'd have out of this weapon was far more bearable with the suppressor. Additionally, you don't lose a huge amount of velocity by attaching a suppressor, as it takes the weapon from 340 meters per second to just 270. Percentage-wise, that's not a lot compared to other guns that adopt a suppressor. Finally, for the underbarrel attachment, I went with the vertical grip. Again, if you were going for accuracy, the stubby was my other option here, but that vertical grip just gave me a great on-the-move performance when paired with the laser from earlier. I feel like this setup was the best for hip-firing away enemies that were just a bit too close to me and allowing me to tear accurately into enemies in the UMP-45's quasi-sweet spot in the 10 to 20 meter range. Overall, there are better weapons for beasting in close quarters, which is why the ninja approach seemed to be the best with the UMP-45. The UMP-45 is mediocre. The damage doesn't defeat other CQB options over time, the range performance is terrible, and the only saving graces are controllability and headshot power, particularly on hardcore. If you're playing on hardcore, the UMP-45 might be a more viable option, but on normal core, the UMP-45 doesn't have much to offer that its competitors don't already do better. Feel free to use it, as it is totally plausible to have good rounds and fun with the UMP-45, it's just that it doesn't have a multiplicative effect on good play. So that's why I say no. If you want a much more reliable CQB blaster, you may wish to consider the P90, which has stellar performance up close and more than enough ammunition to down an entire team. The P90 falls apart at longer ranges, but that's the trade-off you make with that weapon. If you're not cool with making trades, you can instead use the Ace-52 CQB, which has great performance at a variety of ranges. As a carbine, it can also be used by every class. That's it for this episode of Yes or No. If there's something you think I missed, or if you have a particularly different take on the UMP-45, please let me know in the comments below. If there's a weapon you'd like to see reviewed on this series, leave a comment indicating which weapon. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, YouTube.